Everyone in the lecture hall turned to look at her when the teacher called her name. The room, filled with over 50 students dressed in polished clothes, buzzing with side whispers and the flicker of laptop keys, suddenly fell silent. The girl stood out, not because she was loud, not because she did anything wrong, but because she was quiet. Too quiet. Dressed in a plain hoodie and worn jeans, she had taken a seat near the back, head slightly down, avoiding the professor's eyes. She hadn't spoken much all semester. She just showed up, sat in silence, took notes, and left. But on that particular day, something shifted. Professor Langston, known for his demanding teaching style and no-nonsense approach, had enough of students not answering his questions. He scanned the room, his eyes narrowing with each second, until they landed on her. "You," he said sharply, pointing directly at her. The girl blinked, not expecting the spotlight. "Yes, you," he said again. "Come solve this equation on the board." There was a moment when she didn't move. Not out of defiance, but out of uncertainty. Everyone turned their heads toward her, watching. Some students whispered, others rolled their eyes. One smirked and leaned back, whispering, "She's gonna choke for sure." No one knew her name. She had transferred in late. Quiet. Reserved. No flashy entrance, no social media presence. People barely remembered she was in the room. But what no one realized, not the professor, not the students, not even the teaching assistant, was that this simple, young black woman had spent years studying math in silence. Not in prestigious institutions or under famous mentors, but on her own. Late at night. In public libraries. In cramped apartments. On her phone during bus rides. She loved numbers the way poets love words. Math was her quiet language. Still, standing there with every eye fixed on her, she didn't feel like a genius. She felt small, nervous, and out of place. Professor Langston tapped the board impatiently, the chalk clicking against the surface. "We don't have all day." The equation behind him wasn't basic arithmetic. It was a multivariable, high-level calculus problem, something most students in the room couldn't solve under pressure. He thought by calling her up, he'd make a point. Remind everyone that not paying attention came with consequences. He didn't expect much from her. To him, she was just another face in the back row. She slowly rose, heart pounding, and walked down the aisle between the desks. Her shoes made a soft tapping sound against the floor. Each step felt like a mile. She could feel their stares on her back, judging, waiting. A few students snickered softly. A couple of phones were raised, recording. When she reached the whiteboard, the marker felt too big in her hand. She stood there for a second, staring at the problem. A pause hung heavy in the room. Professor Langston folded his arms. "Well? Let's go. Show us what you've got." Her hands were slightly shaking. But then something clicked. Her eyes locked on the equation again, and this time, her breathing slowed. Her brain, trained over years of hidden studying and relentless practice, began moving faster than her nerves. She raised the marker and began writing. Not hesitantly, but with surprising accuracy. The numbers and symbols flowed from her hand like water from a faucet. Step by step, she broke the problem down. Her form was clean, her logic precise. She didn't hesitate. She didn't stammer. The room got quiet again. Phones lowered. Whispers stopped. Professor Langston's expression shifted slightly, eyes narrowing not in skepticism now, but in curiosity. One student leaned forward, whispering, "Wait, is she actually solving this?" Within minutes, she reached the final answer. Her last stroke of the marker echoed against the board. Then she turned around slowly, eyes calm now, as if something deep within her had just been released. The student stared at the board in disbelief. Every step was correct. Every line flawless. But before anyone could say anything, Professor Langston stepped closer, scanning the solution, his expression unreadable. He picked up the marker and traced a few steps, double-checking. Dead silence. The girl waited, eyes watching him. And then, with a voice that was no longer stern but edged with surprise, he said, "Who taught you this?" She paused. "I taught myself." That sentence hit the room like a dropped weight. Students exchanged glances. A few mouths hung open. Professor Langston, usually known for being critical, didn't say a word for a moment. He looked again at her solution. He couldn't find a single flaw. It wasn't just correct, it was elegant. Sharp. Insightful. But just as the class began to process what they had witnessed, the door at the back of the lecture hall opened. A man in a tailored suit walked in, scanned the room, and motioned toward the girl. She looked confused. Professor Langston raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me," the man said. "I need a word with her. It's urgent." She glanced at the professor, who gave a silent nod. The man whispered something in her ear. Her eyes widened. She followed him out without a word. Now the class was buzzing. "Who is she? Did you see how fast she solved that? Wait, did that guy just say something about an institute? She said she taught herself. How is that even possible?" And the biggest question lingering in everyone's mind, how could someone who seemed so invisible, so quiet, so ordinary, hide brilliance like that? Back in the hallway, the man explained. "We've been watching submissions to online math competitions. Your work caught the attention of a few high-level researchers. One of them is offering you a position. But that's just the beginning." And that was when everything started to change. But inside the lecture hall, none of them knew the full story yet. Not the professor. Not the students. Not even the ones who had secretly recorded the moment on their phones. Because what was coming next was going to shock them all. She walked beside the man in the hallway, heart pounding in her chest, barely able to process everything he had just told her. His voice was calm, but there was urgency in it, something about research programs, about mathematical innovation, about a foundation that had seen her work online and had been trying to identify her real identity for weeks. Her hand still had faint ink smudges from the marker, and her mind was still half in the equation she'd just solved in front of a room that had underestimated her the moment she walked in. He led her to a quiet room just outside the lecture hall and closed the door gently. Inside, a woman in a sharp gray blazer stood with a clipboard, her expression unreadable, like someone used to dealing with high-level people every day. The man handed her a folder. "This is her," he said simply. The woman looked her over, then nodded slowly. "You're even younger than I expected." She didn't know how to respond. She didn't even know who these people really were. She had spent the last few years trying to get into this university, working shifts at night, studying during the day, helping her younger siblings with homework. She wasn't here to be noticed. She just wanted a chance to learn. But somehow, quietly, her submissions to free math forums, online competition boards, and anonymous academic threads had started attracting attention. "We've tracked your work for a while now," the woman continued. "You go by Numbers Inc. online, right?" Her eyes widened slightly. That name, she hadn't used it in over a year. She had chosen it when she was 16, posting complex solutions anonymously on late-night math challenge sites. It had been her escape, her little corner of the internet where she could just be brilliant without being judged by how she looked or where she came from. The woman handed her a folder. "That's a preliminary offer. But more importantly, we're inviting you to something bigger. A mentorship. Possibly even co-research. With people who've spent decades building systems and codes most students haven't even read about." She stared at the folder, but her fingers didn't move to open it. Her mind was still back in that classroom, Professor Langston's eyes fixed on her, the surprised hush of her classmates, the disbelief. It wasn't validation she wanted. It was fairness. It was the space to grow without being dragged to the front only when someone wanted to make a point. Back in the lecture hall, Professor Langston remained unusually quiet. He sat at his desk long after the students had left, the problem still scrawled across the whiteboard in front of him. He wasn't just surprised, he was embarrassed. He had called her out to make an example. And she had done just that, only in a way he hadn't expected. For a man who prided himself on identifying potential, he realized he hadn't even tried to understand her. He didn't even know her name. The teaching assistant, Mia, approached him cautiously. "She's not on your radar, is she?" "No," he admitted. "But she should have been." Meanwhile, across campus, the girl, whose full name was Amara Ellis, sat on a quiet bench with the folder resting on her knees. She hadn't opened it yet. Part of her still didn't trust that any of this was real. She had spent so long being overlooked that recognition felt foreign. Growing up in a neighborhood where advanced math wasn't even offered in school, she had taught herself with second-hand textbooks and borrowed library computers. She never complained. She just kept going. Always hoping that one day, someone would see what she saw when she looked at numbers. That day had finally come, but it felt too fast. Back at her apartment, her roommate Jasmine was already seeing clips from the class going viral. Someone had uploaded a short video, Amara standing at the board, solving the problem while the professor watched in silence. The comments were pouring in. "She's brilliant." She shut the whole room down. Never judge a book by its cover. It was strange. People who hadn't said 2 words to her in class were now resharing her moment. Some were tagging her, others trying to guess who she was. But Amara wasn't interested in the attention. She was thinking about what came next. The woman from the research group had given her a week to decide. The opportunity could mean stepping into rooms where equations were translated into real-world breakthroughs, where she could finally speak her mind without being underestimated. But she wasn't sure she was ready to leave behind the path she'd fought so hard to build here. The next day, Professor Langston opened the class differently. He looked around at the faces staring back at him and said, "Yesterday, something happened in this classroom. Something important." A hush fell over the room. Too often, we judge people before giving them the chance to show who they really are. And I did that. No one responded, but every student knew what he was talking about. She didn't just solve the problem. She taught us a lesson I couldn't put on the syllabus. One I'll be thinking about for a long time. That afternoon, Amara received an email. Not from the research group, but from the professor. "I owe you a conversation. Coffee, if you're willing." She didn't reply right away. She was still sorting through everything, her past, her future, and the sudden pressure of being seen. But what she didn't know yet was that this was just the beginning of a much larger journey. One that would test her more than any equation ever could. Because recognition opens doors, but it also brings challenges. And someone, somewhere, wasn't happy about the attention she was getting. The quiet girl in the back was no longer invisible. Amara didn't respond to the professor's message for 3 days. It wasn't out of pride, and it wasn't out of spite. She just needed time. Her mind was in 1,000 places at once, trying to focus on homework while strangers on campus whispered as she walked by, while anonymous messages filled her inbox, some supportive, some unsettling. She was still the same quiet girl who sat in the back of the class, but now it felt like everyone's eyes followed her every move. She never asked for attention. She just wanted to learn. But somehow, her gift had pulled her into a spotlight she didn't choose. Her roommate Jasmine noticed the change too. Amara had always kept a low profile, always focused, never the one to talk much about herself. But now, she barely spoke at all. She spent more time in the library than usual, diving deeper into advanced math journals and research papers, as if she could bury the noise under equations. But even there, peace was hard to find. A few students had started approaching her, some out of curiosity, some with thinly veiled envy, and a few with carefully worded questions pretending to be friendly. One afternoon, she was approached by a young man named Malik. He introduced himself as part of the university's Honors Math Society. He was polite, confident, and clearly intelligent. He had heard about what happened in Professor Langston's class and said he wanted to talk, about research, about mentorship, maybe even about opportunities to collaborate. But Amara sensed something behind his polished words. He seemed too interested, too quick to offer support, as if he had something to gain. She listened carefully but remained noncommittal, watching the way his eyes flicked to the folder still poking out of her bag. The same folder she still hadn't opened. Later that night, Amara finally clicked the message from the research organization. The subject line was simple: "We are still waiting." Inside the email were links to projects she could be involved in, real-world applications in cryptography, algorithms, even quantum modeling. Things she had only dreamed of. But at the bottom of the message was a line that made her pause. "Just know, once you accept this opportunity, things will change. You will not go unnoticed again." That line sat with her. It wasn't a threat, but it was a warning. Attention brings opportunities, but also risk. And Amara, as brilliant as she was, still didn't know who she could really trust. She had no mentor guiding her through these choices. No family members who had walked this road before. Her mother, back home, was proud but didn't understand the world Amara was stepping into. "Just do what makes you happy, baby," her mom had said over the phone. But happiness wasn't the issue, it was pressure. Meanwhile, on the other side of campus, Professor Langston was having his own quiet reckoning. The administration had heard about the incident in his classroom. They hadn't reprimanded him, but the message was clear: they were watching. He had been the golden standard for years, known for his elite teaching style, tough grading, and sharp intellect. But in a single moment, a girl he didn't even know had cracked open the illusion of his authority. And now, some of his colleagues were questioning whether he had overlooked other talents, whether his standards were biased in ways he hadn't even noticed. To protect his reputation, Langston started asking questions of his own. He wanted to know where Amara had come from, what her background was, why she wasn't already in the advanced program. But every step he took only highlighted what he had missed. Her file was clean but modest, strong grades, nothing flashy, but consistently solid. No red flags, just a student quietly doing the work. She wasn't part of any clubs. She hadn't sought attention. She had done everything right, and yet he had still dismissed her. And then, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived at the dean's office, anonymous but pointed. It raised concerns about Amara's sudden rise in visibility. The letter accused her of receiving unfair advantages, possibly manipulating her way into recognition. It suggested that she may have received unauthorized help solving the equation in class. It didn't name any source. It was vague but malicious. And it landed on the dean's desk just days before the university was scheduled to recognize standout students in a public academic feature. The dean, while skeptical of the letter, couldn't ignore it completely. A quiet investigation was opened, not formal, not public, but enough to make people start whispering. Word reached Amara through Jasmine, who overheard two administrators talking near the student lounge. "They think someone like me couldn't have figured it out on my own," Amara said quietly that night, her voice steady but tired. Jasmine tried to reassure her, but Amara already knew what this was. It wasn't about math anymore. It was about perception. About people uncomfortable with brilliance that didn't come in the form they expected. It was about systems designed to doubt. At the same time, Malik returned, this time with a proposal. He claimed to know people who could help smooth things over. He said he could connect her with alumni, professors, people who could vouch for her and silence the rumors. But his tone had shifted. It wasn't a suggestion anymore, it was pressure. When Amara declined, politely but firmly, something cold flickered in his eyes. "You should be careful," he said. "This kind of attention doesn't last." "But the wrong kind? That sticks." She said nothing. But inside, her resolve hardened. She wasn't here to be liked. She was here because she had worked harder than anyone could imagine. Because every formula she wrote was written with hands that had washed dishes, stacked boxes, and helped siblings with homework between studying. She didn't need validation. But she would not let anyone take away what she had earned. As the academic ceremony approached, tensions built quietly. Students picked sides without realizing it. Some were in awe of her talent. Others whispered doubts they couldn't prove. The research team checked in again, asking if she had made a decision. And in the background, the anonymous accusations lingered, still without a name, but no less dangerous. Amara stood at a crossroads, surrounded by potential, pressure, and politics. But the question remained, who sent that letter? And why? And more importantly, what were they afraid of? Amara woke up the morning of the academic showcase with a tight feeling in her chest. The air in her dorm room felt heavier than usual, the kind of weight that comes not from fear, but from knowing something is about to shift, and that there's no way back once it does. She stood in front of the mirror for a while, adjusting her blazer, smoothing her curls, repeating to herself, "You belong here. You earned this." But even as she whispered those words, the buzz around campus was louder than ever. Word had gotten out that Amara would be featured as a standout student during the showcase. Her name was printed on the program. There was a short bio written underneath, third-year mathematics major with focus in number theory. Recognized for exceptional in-class problem-solving under pressure. It was simple, almost clinical, but everyone knew what it meant. It was that moment, the day she'd been called to the board and solved the unsolvable. The same moment that had brought admiration and suspicion in equal measure. Outside the auditorium, students gathered early. Whispers traveled fast. Some said the administration was debating pulling her from the program last minute because of the anonymous accusation. Others claimed she was still under quiet investigation, that the showcase was a test to see how she'd handle pressure. Jasmine stayed close to her all morning, refusing to let Amara get swallowed up in the noise. "They're scared," she whispered, nudging her gently. "Not of what you did, but of what you might still do." Meanwhile, Professor Langston sat in his office, staring at the same folder he'd read over a dozen times. Amara's name was now permanently etched in his mind, not as a symbol of rebellion, but of something he had overlooked. He had started to question his own assumptions. Why hadn't he seen her before? Why had he assumed that brilliance couldn't come from someone who didn't speak up? The weight of his silence that day in class was now echoing louder than his voice ever had. He had learned something else too. That letter, the one sent to the dean, it didn't come from someone random. It had originated from someone within the Honors Math Society. Someone who'd been watching Amara closely ever since she solved that equation. Someone who had something to lose. It was Malik. Langston had no solid proof, just rumors and a subtle digital trail left behind in a shared folder on the Society's research drive. But it was enough to make him realize how deep the resentment ran. For some, Amara's presence wasn't just a surprise, it was a disruption. And disruptions make people uncomfortable. Especially when they expose uncomfortable truths. Back in the auditorium, the lights dimmed as the showcase began. A speaker from the administration stepped onto the stage, offering welcoming remarks. Students were recognized for various accomplishments, publications, competitions, leadership. Then, just before Amara's name was to be called, there was a sudden pause in the program. A soft murmur spread across the audience. Someone was whispering to the presenter backstage. Papers were being shuffled. The presenter glanced toward the front row where the dean sat, then back toward the microphone. Tension cracked in the air like static. Jasmine grabbed Amara's hand. "Don't react," she whispered. "Whatever happens, don't let them see you shaken." The speaker returned to the mic with a calm voice that didn't match the visible confusion. "Before we continue with our next honoree," he said slowly, "we would like to acknowledge an ongoing review of procedural matters. As such, the presentation of this recognition will be postponed until a later date." A single name had not been called, but everyone knew who it was. Amara didn't move. She didn't blink. She simply folded the program in her lap, nodded once, and stood up slowly. The room didn't clap. It didn't cheer. It just held its breath. She walked out without a word, head held high, her silence louder than anything she could have said. Outside, under the cold afternoon sky, Amara leaned against a stone bench while Jasmine paced in front of her, furious. They didn't even try to hide it. They let you sit there, waited till your name was up, then pulled you. You know what that was? That was a performance. They didn't want you to be honored. They wanted to humiliate you. But Amara wasn't shaken. Not anymore. If anything, something had shifted inside her, solidified. She pulled out her phone and opened the email from the Research Foundation. Her finger hovered over the reply button. "I think it's time," she said quietly. "What? You're accepting?" Jasmine asked. "I'm done waiting for permission from people who don't want me here." They don't get to decide my value. Just then, her phone buzzed again. A new message. It was from Professor Langston. All eyes are on you now. That's a lot of pressure. But it also means you've already changed the room. Don't let them shrink you. I owe you an apology, and more than that, I think I owe you an opportunity. Attached was a document, an offer to co-author a research paper on the mathematical principles behind the very equation she solved in class. Her name would be first. His would be second. Amara stared at the screen, the tension in her chest slowly untangling into something else. Determination. The battle wasn't over, but now she wasn't alone in it. At the same time, Malik received a message too. An anonymous tip had reached the university's internal review board, tracing the original complaint email to his student ID. An investigation would begin in the next 48 hours. And across campus, students were starting to talk again, this time louder, and this time with clarity. The story was no longer about a girl solving a math problem. It was about a system that hadn't expected her to. And what happened when she did? The real climax hadn't arrived yet, but everyone knew it was coming. And when it did, Amara wouldn't just be the quiet girl in the back of the room anymore. She would be the one who rewrote the equation, for everyone. Just when it seemed like Amara was regaining control of her narrative, the story took another sharp turn, one she didn't see coming. The next morning, her inbox was flooded. Not with support or outrage, but with confusion. Screenshots were circulating across campus group chats, hinting that Amara had plagiarized a portion of a research abstract she'd submitted months earlier. The timing was no coincidence. And though the claims were thin and the screenshots suspiciously edited, the damage had already begun. Whispers turned into debates. Students who once stood by her began to question. Even Jasmine, ever loyal, looked at her sideways for a brief second before shaking it off. "This is a setup," she said, scrolling through a thread filled with people dissecting Amara's past. "Someone's going hard to bury you." At first, Amara couldn't believe it. She had always kept her work meticulous, often triple-checking citations and running her own plagiarism scans. But the screenshots were damning, at least to people who didn't know her. And that's when she realized, whoever was behind this didn't need truth. They just needed doubt. Doubt was enough to stain everything she'd built. Meanwhile, Professor Langston sat in a faculty meeting where the topic of academic integrity investigations was casually brought up. It wasn't explicit, but he knew they were referring to Amara. He pushed back, demanded transparency, but the room was quiet. Some faculty members avoided his eye. Others murmured about reputational risk. It became painfully clear, while some were rooting for Amara, others were terrified of what her success represented. A quiet genius, a black woman from an underrepresented background, had cracked a code others couldn't, and the system didn't know how to hold that truth. Back at her dorm, Amara tried to remain calm. But it wasn't just about her anymore. News had reached the foundation that had offered her the research collaboration, and they'd sent a neutral, cautious email. "We've been made aware of concerns surrounding your academic history. Please allow us time to review before we move forward." Her future, the one she'd begun to hope for, was once again hanging in the balance. Still, Jasmine refused to let her spiral. "Let's trace it," she said. "If this is fake, there has to be a digital trail. Screenshots don't appear from nowhere." They went into full detective mode, combing through IP addresses, document edit histories, and old cloud folders. It was tedious work, but by day 3, they found something strange. There was a duplicate Google Doc from one of Amara's freshman projects, an early version she'd scrapped. But this version had been downloaded multiple times in the last week from an account that didn't belong to her. Jasmine recognized the email format. It was the student login ID used by someone in the Honors Math Society. Again. And just like before, the digital fingerprint led back to Malik. What neither of them knew yet was that Malik had been quietly building a plan ever since the day Amara stood at the whiteboard. He'd been the top of the class for 2 straight years. Had awards. Professors mentioned his name in recommendation letters like a reflex. But when Amara came along and solved a problem he couldn't, the spotlight shifted. And for some people, that was unacceptable. But Malik wasn't working alone. Hidden in the shadows of the society's group chats was a subtle, consistent pattern: encouragement from someone older, someone influential. A former graduate of the university now employed by a private research institute that quietly partnered with the school. His name hadn't surfaced until now, but his involvement was strategic. He wanted Amara to vanish quietly, and Malik was the perfect pawn. The plan had always been to discredit her early, before she gained more ground. But Amara's growing recognition forced them to escalate. The fake screenshots? A panic move. A sloppy one. And Amara and Jasmine had just discovered a crack in it. But now, time was running out. The dean had scheduled a private review panel for Amara's case. No public statement. No press. Just a quiet decision in a closed room that could derail everything. Amara would have to defend herself, unsupported, in a meeting with faculty members, some of whom had already made up their minds. Meanwhile, Professor Langston, frustrated with the silence of the institution, decided to take a bigger risk. He called in a favor from a former colleague who now worked in investigative journalism. He handed over everything: the suspicious screenshots, the IP trail, the documents linking Malik to the tampered files. It was dangerous. Possibly career-altering. But he couldn't stand by and watch a brilliant student get crushed under politics and quiet racism. The journalist, intrigued and cautious, agreed to dig. She warned Langston that exposing this wouldn't be easy. Institutions protect themselves. But if there was something there, she'd find it. Back on campus, Amara prepared for the review hearing. She printed every original document she had, highlighted timestamps, even practiced responses to expected questions. But nothing prepared her for what happened next. The night before the hearing, she received a text message from an unknown number. It contained only one line. "Don't show up tomorrow. For your own good." No name. No explanation. Just enough to raise every hair on the back of her neck. Jasmine read it and went cold. They're scared. This is intimidation. That means you're close to something they want buried. But for Amara, it was more than that. It was a sign that her story had grown too big, too fast. And now, someone was trying to control how it ended. As dawn approached, the question wasn't just whether she would win the hearing, it was whether she'd make it through it at all. The stakes had shifted. This wasn't just a fight for credit or recognition anymore. It was about truth. About power. And about who gets to stand at the front of the room and be seen. And as the morning light crept across her windowpane, Amara realized something that steadied her heart, even amid the fear. She wasn't walking into that hearing to ask for acceptance. She was walking in to reclaim what was already hers. The morning of the hearing arrived with a strange quiet over campus. It was as if even the wind knew something serious was about to happen. Amara walked to the administrative building, head high but hands trembling, holding a folder filled with carefully organized evidence. Jasmine walked silently beside her until they reached the steps. "You've got this," she whispered, squeezing her shoulder. Amara nodded but said nothing. Her heart thudded in her ears. Inside, the review panel sat in a long, cold room. Four professors, including one Amara didn't recognize, sat behind a long table. Professor Langston was there, too, seated on the far end, looking composed but alert. Amara stood before them, back straight, eyes clear. She was ready, at least she told herself that. They began with formalities. Then came the accusations, laid out in careful, clinical language. Terms like academic dishonesty, discrepancy in documentation, and integrity protocol were tossed around like stones. When they asked her to respond, Amara didn't falter. She opened her folder and calmly began laying out the timeline, real documents, original timestamps, edit histories, IP traces. She showed how her supposed, plagiarized, material had been lifted from her own unpublished drafts and altered. She paused only once, to breathe. Then continued, presenting screenshots of cloud activity that clearly linked the downloads to Malik's student ID. The room was still. Eyes moved from the papers in her hand to each other, unsure what to make of the sharp turn the meeting had taken. One professor cleared his throat. "These are serious counterclaims, Ms. Dean. Why didn't you present this earlier?" "Because I was too busy being called a fraud before anyone asked me a question," Amara replied, her voice steady. "And because I didn't realize until now how far some people would go just to keep someone like me from taking up space." There was silence. A heavy, uncomfortable kind of silence. Then Professor Langston spoke. He slid a sealed envelope across the table. "I believe you should see this," he said to the panel. "It's from an investigative journalist. It contains an independent digital forensics report and corroborates everything Ms. Dean just stated, including the link between the files and a graduate employee currently under contract with a university-affiliated research center." The panel opened the envelope. Their eyes moved rapidly as they skimmed. One of them muttered something under their breath. Another leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, as though reconsidering everything. But just when it seemed like the room might tilt in Amara's favor, the unexpected happened. The door opened. Malik stepped in, uninvited. He looked thinner than usual. Sleep-deprived. Nervous. He walked up and stood beside Amara, saying nothing at first. The panel looked stunned. One member asked, "Mr. Karim, you weren't scheduled to speak." "I know," Malik interrupted. "But I need to." He turned to Amara, then to the panel. "She's telling the truth. I took the draft. I manipulated the screenshots. I thought if I could just make it look like she cheated, people would stop comparing us." Amara froze. For a moment, the air was too thick to breathe. "I wasn't working alone," Malik continued, glancing at the panel. "I was approached by someone who said Amara's research could disrupt a funding structure that had been in place for years. I was stupid. I agreed. And I'm sorry." His voice cracked. Professor Langston didn't react, didn't blink. The panel, however, buzzed with murmurs. One professor asked, "Do you understand the seriousness of your actions, Mr. Karim?" "I do. And I'll accept whatever punishment I deserve. But she shouldn't be punished for being B. The hearing ended shortly after. No final verdict was delivered that morning. They needed time, they said. But everyone in that room knew the truth was no longer in question. By the time Amara stepped out of the building, the sun had broken through the clouds. Jasmine was waiting by the steps, phone in hand, face lit up. "It's already online," she said. "The article. The journalist just dropped it. The school's name is all over Twitter." Overnight, everything changed. The article exposed not just Malik's role, but a quiet pattern of academic suppression, one that had been in place for years, especially affecting students of color. Several faculty members were placed on administrative leave. The external research center that had orchestrated the plan lost its funding deal with the school. And Amara? She became a name people started whispering with respect. But even then, just when it seemed like the final twist had played out, one more surprise arrived. A week later, Amara got an email. Not from the school, not from the media, but from a private aerospace firm. They had read the article, seen the whiteboard video, traced her early work. "We believe your mind is exactly what our next innovation needs," the message read. "We'd like to invite you to lead a new math-based research program, fully funded, with your own team." Amara stared at the screen for a long time. She had walked into a classroom expecting silence. She left the university with her head held high, reputation cleared, and a future bigger than anything she had imagined. No one in that school had expected her to rise, least of all the elite teacher who had once tried to make an example out of her. But the only example Amara became, was proof. Proof that brilliance has no set face. And truth, real truth, always finds a way to speak. In the days that followed Malik's confession and the explosive article, Amara's world slowly began to shift. What had started as humiliation in a classroom had unraveled into a story that reached beyond the university halls. She found herself walking past students who once ignored her, now nodding or offering kind words. Even professors she had never spoken to sent her emails quietly expressing support, or in some cases, regret. One even invited her to guest lecture on mathematical theories she had been developing. Amara didn't crave fame. She wasn't interested in revenge. But she did feel something new, peace. And not the kind that comes from things going quiet, but the kind that comes when truth finally stands taller than doubt. She had survived something designed to break her. More than that, she had exposed a system that had been silent for too long. Back home, her mother sat in the living room reading the newspaper with a headline that made Amara both proud and a little overwhelmed: "Math Genius Outsmarts Academic Sabotage, University Launches Investigation." Her mother looked up with tears in her eyes and simply said, "Your father would have been so proud, baby." And that was the only validation Amara ever truly needed. But even with justice served, there were loose ends that still tugged at her. Professor Langston remained mostly silent through it all. He had made his statement, protected Amara when it mattered, but never offered her an apology. It bothered her. So one afternoon, she knocked on his office door. He looked up, startled, and gestured for her to come in. "I wanted to ask you something," she said. "Why did you push me so hard in class? Why humiliate me in front of everyone?" Langston leaned back in his chair. "Because I wanted to see if your fire was real. I've seen students who shined for a moment and then faded when things got difficult. You didn't fade. You turned it into fuel." Amara narrowed her eyes. "So it was some kind of test?" "Not exactly," he admitted. But I also didn't think you'd survive it the way you did. That's on me. It wasn't an apology. But it was close. And Amara took it for what it was, acknowledgement. Sometimes that's as much as people like Langston are capable of giving. She nodded and turned to leave. Before she stepped out, he added, "That theorem you wrote in your final draft, about infinite inverses within closed systems, that's genius-level work. Just so you know." She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. She just walked out, smiling to herself. Meanwhile, Malik was expelled. Quietly. No press release. No major announcement. Just a short statement about a student being dismissed for academic misconduct. Amara didn't celebrate it, but she also didn't feel sorry. He had made a choice. And now, he had to live with it. As the semester ended, Amara received the official letter from the aerospace firm. Not only were they funding her to lead a research initiative, they were also naming the lab after her. The Dean Initiative. It felt surreal. She read the letter 3 times before it sank in. She returned to her old neighborhood before leaving town, visiting her old math teacher from high school, Mrs. Wallace, who used to let her stay after class and solve puzzles when other kids were outside. Mrs. Wallace cried when she heard the news. "You always had something in you, Amara," she said. "It's just the world took a while to notice." The final night before she moved for her new job, Amara stood outside her apartment and looked up at the stars. Jasmine joined her, sipping hot tea. "You know," Jasmine said, "this whole thing started because someone underestimated you." "Yeah," Amara replied. "And maybe that's exactly why I had to prove them wrong." They both laughed. The kind of laugh that comes after surviving a storm together. Real, deep, and healing. As Amara packed her things and left for the next chapter of her life, she carried with her more than degrees or awards. She carried the scars of being underestimated, the strength of overcoming doubt, and the knowledge that brilliance isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's quiet. Simple. Unassuming. Until it's undeniable. The story of a black woman solving a math problem in front of a class wasn't just about math. It was about identity. Power. Perception. It was about what happens when systems are challenged not with noise, but with proof. In the end, Amara didn't just solve an equation. She solved a larger problem, one written between the lines of prejudice and silence. She proved that even in a room built to ignore her, her mind couldn't be denied. And for anyone who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or quietly pushed aside, her story stood as a reminder: genius doesn't need permission to shine. It just needs a chance. And once it gets that chance, there's no stopping it.